Let us now turn to the question what anonymization of data means. We cannot find the definition throughout the GDPR of the term anonymous or anonymized, but what we have is a definition of personal data. That's in the definition section, that's Article 4, Para 1, stating personal data means any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, and an identifiable natural person is one who can be identified directly or indirectly, that's important, in particular by reference to an identifier such as name, identification number, and others. So if we combine this with, again, recital 26, next slide, please. We find a very similar wording here. So the principles of data protection should therefore not apply to anonymous information, namely information which does not relate to an identified or identifiable natural person. So that leads us to the conclusion that personal data and anonymous or anonymized data are somehow counter terms. Data are either personal or they are anonymous. I call that the dichotomy of data protection law. So the whole data protection regulation is only applicable to personal data and not to anonymous data, legally speaking. If that is in reality really the whole truth, we will see that. Now, we must ask ourselves what renders personal data into anonymized data. Yeah, and we again turn to recital 26, where the answer lies. To determine whether a natural person is identifiable, account should be taken of all the means reasonably likely to be used, such as singling out, either by the controller or by another person, to identify the natural person directly or indirectly, and to ascertain whether means are reasonably likely to be used to identify the natural person. Account should be taken of all objective factors, such as cost and time required for identification, and taking into consideration available technology at the time of the processing and technological developments. A very important conclusion that can be drawn from this wording is that the so-called absolute anonymity is neither achievable nor required by the GDPR. Instead, it's a realistic and a legally sufficient approach to make re-identification unlikely. And a second, even more important conclusion is that anonymity is never static, but depends on the context knowledge of the people working with the data. So let's turn to a very simple example to illustrate that. The name, for example, Harry Smith in English would be Hans Müller in German, and we can find some other names in other languages, will identify somebody in a classroom, but not globally. Because in a classroom, everybody would know who is the person with that name. But if you try to find out in the internet who's Harry Smith, you will have thousands of results. Another well-known example is the re-identification of Governor William Holt. This case is based on the publication of health insurance data, which was common 2 decades ago in Massachusetts. And the data was stripped of direct identifiers as name and address, for example, but on the other hand, contained the full date of birth and the zip code. And the re-identification, however, was only possible because Governor Weld was a public figure. So as a governor, as a politician, well known public. so that many context information was publicly available. And that was, for example, he collapsed in a TV show so that everybody could know that the governor has had an issue, an health issue, so would be very quickly go to a hospital. And then there was much other information on the web publicly available, such as the voter data set, which was always also published, and more medical data were in previous press articles. So many context information available to a huge group of people. And then there was, let's say, just by chance, the combination of some of these data sets led to a unique result, which is not always the case. So that's why the governor could be identified out of this database of health insurance data, so that many of her personal data were then public. So that leads us to the main conclusion that there's no absolute anonymity, there's only so-called de facto anonymity. And we can summarize the important factors to determine whether a data set is anonymized as follows. So important factors are availability of information, including context knowledge. So I'm referring again to Harry Smith. Not enough to identify an individual globally, no singling out, but enough to be identified in a classroom. Then the goal of a potential attacker is very important. So counting people on the street for just statistical reasons is not very likely to be hacked, or is not so important, but counting, bypassing renowned actors, film stars in a certain street is of course interesting for the yellow press. Then the effort to achieve identification, so easy access for employees is not a good advice, so access should always be controlled. The more people have access to a database, the higher the risk is that re-identification can happen. And last but not least is technology. But be aware that the test is a dynamic one. So one should not only consider the state of the art in technology at the time when the data were captured and stored, but always at the time of processing. So if technology, re-identification technology have been enhanced meanwhile, you have to adapt your safeguards around the data to keep the data safe, and not only safe, but in that status of anonymity. So the very main conclusion and finally is that a crucial factor is the re-identification risk before the background of a certain context. And the conclusion is that organizational measures can even influence the status of anonymity. And I can refer here to a quite, let's say, old opinion of the group of all data protection authorities across Europe that stated putting in place the appropriate state-of-the-art technical and organizational measures to protect the data against identification are not only the consequence of a legal obligation arising from the then Data Protection Directive, but rather a condition for the information precisely not to be considered to be personal data, and its processing not to be subject to the directive, now the regulation. I think this is a very important insight.